Hi, I wanted to make a little bit of a different video. This time is purely commentary about a hot topic, which is the shortages and the supply chains disruptions which have struck. And it's not quite a new issue, but it's getting worse and worse. And everywhere you look now, they're talking about it. So I wanted to comment on that. And this is not an economics channel, but I do have interest in economics, and primarily because I was born during a very sharp economic crisis and grew up in such a time, and it lasted a long time, and it had a great impact on me. And since then I actually study economics hard and keep an eye always on what's going on, because I want to be ready for such times if they are to come again. And maybe some of my personal experience can help out a little bit and just shed some light on what's happening and how people may have to adapt. And let's take a walk in the forest here by the beach, and I'll talk about what I think. So why are there supply chains disruptions and shortages? There's something like hundreds of thousands of containers, millions of containers, hundreds of ships, maybe thousands all over the world, really. In America there are a lot of them, but it's a global problem and it's everywhere. It's in Asia, it's in Europe, it's everywhere. So why did this happen? It is a aftermath of the global problem that we have been having for about 2 years. And this global problem had a global reaction. The reaction was to do some stuff like lock down things and idle factories and workers and ports. And because of that, also there was an economic contraction, and so there weren't orders, there wasn't production, and there wasn't very much happening for a while last year. And then a lot of money was printed, trillions and trillions of dollars, actually unprecedented in the history of the world, how much money was released by governments. And when that money hit people's bank accounts, they started trying to save it, and the demand for things spiked up again, but the production wasn't in place and the labor force wasn't in place. And together with that, when many of these workers had been idled, they were given government relief aid, financial aid, and they were able to not work and still collect payments, and therefore they had more incentive to stay home and not put themselves in danger or have to put any effort and work. So there has been a huge labor shortage for that reason. So you see here the sequence. It's really dark here. Just a second. Here's actually where I am. I'm on the beach in Washington State right now. But the water is a little bit loud, so I'm talking in the forest. But it really is gorgeous and serene, and it helps me feel no stress at all when I'm out here. So you can follow the sequence of events here. We have a global system of trade and shipping, and we have a global problem, and we have a global reaction, and all that has happened in the last 2 years. And you see the keyword there, global, global, global. And as a result, the trade has kind of seized up in the world right now. And that's the thing. We were living in a period of globalization in which everything was coming from somewhere else, and supply chains were extremely complicated and long. So it was not unusual before or even now to buy a product, and that product has passed the world a few times over before you've bought it. So some component was made in one place, the raw materials. Some component may have been made in one place, but the raw materials were for a whole different continent, and it was assembled in a third continent, and it was purchased on a fourth one. And therefore, a tremendous amount of fuel and effort had to be used for this product to end up from where it was made and put together to the end consumer, to wherever it was purchased. It was very wasteful, honestly. And it was a long-standing problem, but as long as there was incentive, it continued being the status quo. However, this global disruption that happened very quickly changed all that, and the incentives changed, and therefore now it is no longer the case that it's so viable to do that, to cross the whole world 3 times over to put a product in someone's hands or house. And that's really fundamentally the problem with the shortages. So it's actually kind of a problem that existed for a long time, and it simply came to a critical point because of a global crisis. So now that we have explained why this problem happened, let's talk about the implications of it now that it has happened, because I believe the implications are going to be very serious and change the lives of people a lot. And maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe I have this kind of fear because of the times I grew up in the place I grew up in. But I grew up in the Eastern Bloc where there was such a thing as a systemic failure when I grew up. So the system that was in place failed, and it was a systemic failure. And it was a very centralized system, and when it did fail, it was very painful to adapt and restructure the entire system. And what we have now is a failure of the global system. And the global system has many components, but it was to a very large degree based on trade. And that trade is now very, very jammed. Think of it as a giant traffic jam in the sea, and almost everything is traded by sea. Therefore, it is very likely that many, many things will not be available for a long time. And honestly, and it's not far-fetched because everyone is now saying that. I am not making some kind of prediction here. This is not blowing the whistle or whatever. I am simply observing what everyone is saying, and that is the case where even the governments are now saying it, all the medias are saying it, all the corporations are saying it. And this is the truth. We are entering a period which is probably going to be the sharpest economic crisis in a century. Maybe comparable to the Great Depression. I don't know how much better or how much worse than it, but it will be comparable in my opinion. And that means we have to change the way we live. It's just not going to work the way we have been doing things. Frankly, people have gotten spoiled and wasteful and lazy in the way they live. So what has to happen now is, instead of, you think about it, for example, right now it's so easy, if you have a good job, to work for a single day, and then you can go and spend something like $1,000, and you can buy something. The raw materials were mined in Africa, it was assembled in China, the design was made in the USA or in Europe, and you can just have it like this just for a few hours of your labor. And that is extremely powerful when it comes to economic power. Every consumer right now, every person out there who has good purchasing power was very, very empowered in this system. But there's strong indications that the system is now over. And if that is so, we're going back to the times when it was not so easy to acquire these things which require such complex labor and such complex supply chains. Therefore, things like cameras or automobiles or computers or so much that you're used to and take for granted and it's cheap now will no longer be so accessible. And that's more so the tip of the iceberg, because it's easy to think of what is now made in Asia and what you may not be able to buy so easily anymore. So because that's the biggest jam, the shipping from Asia to the rest of the world and primarily North America is very, very obstructed. So when you think about it, think about all the things that you need and whether you have them and whether they have to be made far away. Those are the things that you have the hardest time obtaining, at least in the short term. We have already been told probably the shelves will be empty on Christmas. I've already started seeing people posting pictures from empty grocery stores, and all that is happening already. Now, the food is an interesting topic which I'll discuss in a minute, but if you focus on things that are durable, things that are meant to last longer, things that are currently assembled in Asia, you truly are best off if you have already purchased all of them, and you did that probably at a cheap price compared to what is coming. Because right now the effect of all that I'm describing is that prices are spiking and availability is plummeting. Therefore, things are becoming much harder and more expensive to obtain. And that is not going to change anytime soon. There is no switch that you can press and cause the system to come back together. If I am to use a cliched metaphor, Humpty Dumpty is one where he was on the wall, he fell and shattered, and no one could put it back together again. And that is what's happening with the global system. And you can say all you want, what caused it, was it intentional, was it sinister, was it an accident, was it unavoidable, was it just how things are. That's a whole different tangent you can go on. However, that is the fact, and what you have to now do is adapt. So first thing to do is try to secure all the things that you can foresee yourself using in the next few years and not have an inability to get them. So for us, for example, we just redid most of the house. We changed out all the furniture. We made a baby room, and we got all kinds of strollers. Last year we got a brand new car, and now already cars have become very, very hard to get, especially cars made elsewhere. And second-hand cars, for some reason, have spiked so high in price. So it's so crazy that after buying our Jeep last year and driven it for over 10,000 miles, we are now able to sell it at a profit because such cars are now so much more expensive and the demand has gone through the roof. So there's no way we sell it, but if we wanted to, we could actually make money on it, which is crazy. This has never been the case, at least in my lifetime. Maybe in a place like Cuba it has been, which is interesting because Cuba is such a place where there is a systemic failure and it's ground to a halt for decades and no one is fixing the system. But I don't believe that will be the case with the world system, and in particular in the USA I think things will be all right. There will be a painful period of readjustment and restructuring. The system has to change to one where things are made closer to the US again, or within the US. In Mexico is an obvious location. And then they don't have to cross the oceans 3 times over to end up in your store or in your house. Though that will come at a price, because first of all, it takes time and investment. And second, labor is much more expensive here. So the issue with that is that it will be more expensive, period. So your purchasing power is never coming back probably in the next few years and possibly in the rest of your life, because here's the next thing that is going on in parallel is that all industrialized societies in the world right now have hit a demographic peak and are just about to go into decline. Some of them already have gone in decline. Classic example is Japan, which was booming in the 80s, kind of hit the wall in the 90s, and it has never been able to recover. It keeps kind of just declining. It's a managed decline. It's a smooth decline in the case of Japan, but they don't grow anymore. They hit a peak. And if you look at the demographics, they explain why. Because their population is shrinking and no one is of working age in high enough numbers to restore the economic growth. And the trouble is that is happening also in all industrialized societies except one, and that one is the USA. The USA is the only industrialized advanced economy which is actually still growing. All the rest of them, Europe, Asia, are now hitting the wall. Korea, China are the fastest declining populations in the world, and that means their economies simply cannot grow, because when people start aging like that and there are not enough children or people entering the workforce, you simply cannot have economic growth. And without economic growth, you will not have the purchasing power that we have used to having, and you will not be able to get all the goods because there are less people to make them. And so you can think about the previous era since the World War, and especially since 70s, 80s, when America really put together this global system of trade, which was opposed to communism back then. And this system is now coming to an end. And what you have gotten used to perceive, basically the time of plenty, is gone. That's it. And it will be more so like the old days, when things have to be built to last. You have to take good care of things. You have to repair things. You have to preserve them and so on. That's the time we're entering, again, in my opinion. That's not everybody. And it's not maybe a major disaster waiting to happen or something like that. But it is more so the trend and that we're going towards, because this is the case when you do the math. Just very little can be done to avoid that. So as an adaptation also, you want to very much be careful about where your food comes from, because That's really your biggest vulnerability, together with energy, which I also speak about. But food is one that you need to live. And if you run out of food, you die. That's it. We have already seen that food in the grocery stores has started running out. And I haven't seen it. Where we live, there has been nothing like that. The stores that we go to have been completely stocked. And it has me wondering, why does it vary so much? And my theory is that it varies because not everyone lives in a region that has such great food security and supply chains that are able to put food on the shelf so easily as in the region that I live. And also where we live here in Washington, Seattle area, it's also the headquarters for many, many retail corporations like Costco, like Amazon, like REI, like Starbucks, and so on, many of them. And so we are probably better stocked than others, but we are also going to get impacted. We don't have a pass or a, get out of jail free card in this case, but maybe less so. What you really should be concerned with is whether you're close to the source of things. And being close to the source when it comes to food, the source is obviously farms. And some areas are very much urbanized or suburban with tens of millions of people living far away from farms, which means there's a huge demand with very little supply. That is the kind of situation you don't want to find yourself in. I can think of some areas. An obvious one is New York City. There's also Los Angeles, 20 million people living in the desert. There's Arizona, 5 or 6 million people in the Phoenix metro, where there's almost no food production. And these are places where it does not make too much sense that this many people ever lived. And they only ever did because of the time of plenty, which I described. And since that time of plenty has died, basically, has come to an end, it is very easy to see how that type of place will come under economic pressure if there is a food shortage, which there is right now. And also, whether you get food depends on is whether there is enough fuel. So in the US at least, but everywhere just about, the food comes to the stores by truck and it travels a long time, or sometimes the whole country, sometimes from the rest of the world. And you have to think whether the region you live in is a great food producer. In the case of the US West Coast, where I live, it is a very, very powerful agricultural region. California itself probably is the best of all agricultural lands in the world. It has such climate that it can make just about everything. The entire Central Valley of California is planted. But this is not all, because the Northwest, where we live in particular, also is a leader in so many types of crops, and it has a great food supply. And this is just big agriculture. There's also what I'm actually much more interested in, which is a small-scale agriculture, which is around you. And those are smaller farms. They can be organic, and they are your best bet in a time like this, because right now they will continue operating almost unobstructed, and they can still put food in your local farmers market or your local co-op, or perhaps a delivery service, or you can go to the farm and get it. This to me is the best bet. If you live in a region which supports that kind of agriculture, you probably will endure very, very well, because you do not depend on these giant supply chains, giant farms, giant distances, and fuel consumption that have to be spent for you to get your meal every single day. And again, here in the Northwest, in the Seattle area, in the Portland area, all the areas really, we are surrounded by such farms, small-scale farms, farmers markets, co-ops. There's a great abundance of them here, and it's a very fertile place. And the climate is also very mild. And that brings me to my next point. Together with all that, there has now arrived a serious energy shortage. We have seen it in China, where they have turned off the factories pretty much. China is the factory for everything, and China has had to turn off factories something like 4 or 5 days a week and only make things once or twice a week, which is insane. So what would that mean for production. It means it's gonna crash, completely just crash. And they have done that because they're running out of coal, apparently. There's more demand that they can supply. They had kind of a political dispute with Australia, which supplied a lot of their coal. And there's also a spiking demand from everyone for coal and other energy as well. Therefore, prices have risen, and China cannot quite supply the power to its people. And that's very, very disturbing because they have 1.5 billion people, but it doesn't end there. It has now started happening in India, and as winter is approaching, this is only exacerbating to the point where even a wealthy continent, relatively like Europe, is now facing serious problems. The prices have gone sky high. Natural gas is very expensive, and that's most of what Europe relies on for heat in the winter and many other types of energy consumption. And Europe is going to have a really hard time as well. In the US, all these things are milder because the USA simply has more abundance and honestly a better economy than anywhere else. And that means we're better off, but it does not mean that we're immune. And at the very least, the poor people and the middle class will face increasing pressure. Basically, the lower your income is, the more of it is going to go to meeting basics and not so much to be able to spend on material goods and on frivolous things, toys of some sort, whether they're for adults or children. Things other people make are not going to be so easily affordable, even in the US, and depending on your income. Some people will be sheltered who have very high income and have access to things that is better for whatever reason. But in the grand scheme of things, you can see this playing out as a very, very serious impoverishment of the whole world. And it will be uneven by region. Some will be much worse off than others. Some will be rather okay, still poorer than before. Some will adapt faster. Some will adapt slower. Some will enter a very, very vicious economic depression with no end. Sadly, I have started seeing footage from Thailand, for example, where the lack of tourism spending has caused a huge wave of homelessness in Thailand. And Thailand doesn't have that much more industry but tourism. And because of that, they don't have income anymore. That means they don't have the ability to import what they need. And if you look at the stats, something like 80% of the world eats from imports. There are actually very few food exporting nations in the world. You can count them on your fingertips, actually. There's the USA, there's Canada, there's Russia, there's France and Ukraine, and some smaller ones, there's Brazil. But for the most part, you actually don't have that many people that produce enough food to feed themselves. What does that mean? Well, if this goes as badly as many have predicted, we're looking at famine, worldwide serious famine. And this is why I'm talking about how you need to get on top of your food supply. If you can grow your own food, raise chickens in your backyard, you're much better off. Otherwise, what we have done is we have oriented ourselves towards a style of cooking and eating which only needs the raw things. For example, if we get enough meats, if we get enough oils, if we get enough grains, if we get vegetables, and if they're produced nearby, we actually can eat very well. We have learned how to. But if we relied on things that are in boxes, things that came from a factory, things that someone else had to make on the other end of the country or the world, those are not going to be easily available. And you have to know how to cook, know how to source, know how to grow, and you'll be better off. This is how we made it where I'm from, where just about everybody had food gardens and tried to create their own vegetables. And we also used to buy bulk. You could buy a giant amount of flour and you bake, and you can buy a huge pig and you take it to a butcher and you freeze it and you put it in your fridge and you can eat all winter that way. These are the ways that you may have to adapt, because it will be harder for someone to do all that for you. To go to get the animal, to chop it up, to deliver it to your doorstep and so on, this will now be harder and harder. You'll have to do a lot more for yourself. This is the type of time we're entering if all that I'm saying plays out the way it looks like. And that's my main message right there. You have to very quickly begin adapting because it's coming and it's really already here. I think that it is more so at this point too late to even switch where you live. It probably is too soon. And it's hitting right now. Hi. In all honesty, the time to change where you live has come and gone. Probably was 5 years ago, maybe in the last few. But at this point, unless you can immediately uproot your life and study a region which is set up in the way I mentioned, that produces very much of what it needs, that is where you're best off. And one more point to make, you're better off in places with mild climates because energy is much more in places with extremes. For example, in a place like Minnesota, you're going to have huge energy consumption in the winter, and in a place like Arizona in the summer. In both of those places, the climate is such that if you do not have the energy to change the temperature in your house, you will most likely die. And that is a dreadful place to be during an energy shortage. If there's a blackout, if you do not have the money to pay the bill, you may actually face such conditions in what is coming. It is much more so the case in a place like China, India, or Europe, but it definitely is also a threat in the USA as well. So these are things I wanted to bring up and just tell you what I think is happening, because this will be life-changing for just about all of us. It will not end fast, and that is not going to happen. There will be, at least at first, a painful period of restructuring. Maybe in a few years, things will start flowing better and produced locally, because that is the fix. The fix is not instant. It's a slow, painful restructuring of the entire global system, and it will be very difficult to get out of. Some will be better off than others. Let's hope we're among them. Different location now. I'm in beautiful Gig Harbor, but this is a good place to wrap up this video with a topic that I wanted to touch up on, and that is what our channel is normally about, and that is travel and lifestyle. So if we are entering such a period when everything's becoming way more expensive and people are struggling just to secure the basic needs and just the goods that they typically need for around the house, tools, all kinds of stuff that you may need, obviously your priority is not going to be so much your lifestyle. And lifestyle is kind of the last thing you do, the icing on the cake. And if you have seen our channel, you know this. We love to travel, we love to eat out, all the gourmet foods and all that. So can this lifestyle be sustained is a question which begs asking. And I think for most people it will be quite difficult. You kind of have to get creative, and we'll talk about that in future videos about how we're able to mitigate that. But for the moment, yes, our lifestyle is becoming quite expensive. It already costs now this year $100 to fill up our gas tank, and hotel rooms have gotten very expensive here in Washington State. It's almost impossible to find a good room under $200, which is crazy when you think about it in global terms. And all that is not that easy anymore. So with high inflation, it will be difficult. On top of that, we have increased border controls for a variety of reasons. And I don't think these things are going away, to be honest. I don't think it will be as free as we were before ever again in our lives, for a variety of reasons. One of them is this unraveling of the global system. It will be much more polarized and fractured in the future. So can you gallivant around the world as much anymore? I don't think so. And we already haven't left the country for the longest time that we can remember, probably at least in 10 or 15 years. And we don't plan to leave it too much soon. So that is already affecting our lifestyle when you think about it. And that's the case with almost everyone. Some have continued, but it's not as easy as before. Anyone, even the ones that travel for a living, have been quite obstructed by this. And so can it be kept up? Can it be sustained? I think for some it can, but they have to be rather wealthy, and also they have to have alternative lifestyles which allow them to not have to pay entirely for all that they're enjoying when they travel. When it comes to food, we already haven't gone out to eat gourmet a lot that much, really. We have a baby now, and that's a big part of the reason, but also it is no longer as nice. You have all these restrictions, and they have made the places tighter in a way. You have less tables to sit down, and the prices keep going up. So instead of that, we actually have adapted by learning to cook really well, and this will be a topic of future videos as well. But we're trying to master gourmet cooking at home, and that's one way you can adapt. If you were used to eating out these 4-course meals by great chefs, and all of a sudden that cannot be done, learn to do it yourself, and then go and source the best ingredients in your local farmer's market. That will solve a lot of the supply chain problem. So yeah, just you have to get creative. You have to probably invest more time into your skill and into what it takes to keep up certain things about your lifestyle. When it comes to travel, we do intend to travel, but already we have traveled a lot more locally, which is nice because we live in a region which is a good one, and it has a lot of opportunity for that. But I'm sure there are times and places where people cannot do as much anymore, and I don't see that being the case soon. When I was growing up in communism, it was very hard to cross borders, and at least I was born in communism, and then it took a long time till my country got into the whole Schengen zone, and then there were all these border controls. It took a long time for them to come off. And we may be looking at something similar. We just had partial border reopenings, first time in like 18 months or so. That's almost unprecedented. It's almost like wartime, or at least a Cold War. That's what it resembles to me. And it starts resembling a lot the situation in the Eastern Bloc, where there were no goods as much. It was not so affordable to do things. So I think that's more so the world we're entering. So keeping up these lifestyles is going to be rather hard. But that may also be an interesting challenge, and we will persist. We probably can afford more so than some to continue, but also we will get creative and try to make it so our lifestyle remains or maybe even improves, and we'll see what it takes to do that. So that will be a big topic of our channel from now on. For now, let's all hope for the best. See you later.